Good morning and welcome to the SWP How to Improve Water Security webinar. Please hold all questions to the end. We'll be answering questions in the last 20 minutes of the webinar. So if you have any questions throughout, please send them either to the communal chat or you can send them to me, the organizer, in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I guess we'll get started. So hello and thank you for attending this webinar. We hope to propose more of this in the near future, but this is our first experience and we will see how it goes. So my name is Eric Viala. I'm the director of SWP and I have with me my colleague John Parker from Tetra Tech, who's the deputy director. I'd like to also recognize Liz Kendall, whose voice you've heard before and who provides IT support for this webinar. So the Sustainable Water Partnership is a 5-year USAID-funded cooperative agreement. It's basically the flagship water security program from USAID, as it promotes water security as a critical cross-sectoral development theme through pedagogic documents you can find on our website and presentation or webinars such as the current one. SWP, we also implement in-country activities. We currently work in Cambodia and in the Mara Transboundary River Basin in Kenya and Tanzania. We've also done some work in Pakistan and are looking at other countries where we will work with regional or bilateral USAID missions. I will now pass the microphone to John, who's going to provide us with an overview of water security before I come back to explain the water security improvement process that we propose and apply. So John, it's up to you.
Thanks everyone and good morning. I'll start with the big picture. As Eric mentioned, I'll walk us through some context and conceptual information on water security, what it is and why it is important, and then I'll hand it back over to Eric for just a description of the steps within a water security improvement process. So in the water sector, as many of us know, we're very much living in uncertain times as water resources are experiencing unprecedented pressure and degradation. And this, of course, influences and is influenced by instability across other sectors, which we'll be discussing further in subsequent slides. Water security is being impacted by a number of different drivers of risk. Some of the most significant ones are listed here on this slide. It's important to note that most, if not all of these drivers of risk are interconnected. And so these drivers of risk are increasing the scope and scale of water-related challenges globally. We know that climate change plays a significant role in exacerbating these risks and is increasing uncertainty about the future. It speeds up the hydrological cycle, it alters the frequency and intensity of precipitation, and it increases the severity of extreme events. And water risks also come against the backdrop of what can be called a water governance crisis, which is seen by institutions with limited capacity that are under-resourced, inconsistent implementation of sound water management policies and plans, limited good quality information to support evidence-based decisions, and conflicting stakeholder priorities and interests. So this leads us to the importance of water security, and it helps explain why water security is rising to the top of the agenda in many countries around the world. So to start, what do we mean by water security? I'm sure all of us have seen that this term is being increasingly used and many definitions of water security exist. But in essence, water security is about having enough water on an ongoing basis to sustain human life, well-being, and economic development. So SWP has pulled together various definitions of water security, and we define water security as the adaptive capacity to safeguard the availability of, access to, and safe use of an adequate, reliable, and resilient quantity and quality of water for health, livelihoods, ecosystems, and economies. And I'm going to quickly walk us through three important elements of this definition: availability, access, and safe use. So availability refers to sufficient quantities of water from surface or groundwater, both now and in the future. Access considers natural and man-made means to mobilize, store, convey, supply, regulate, and conserve water, encompassing infrastructure to management and service delivery. And safe use has three interrelated elements: adequacy, which ensures that water quality needs are met of all users, including ecosystems; reliability, the predictability and consistency of the resource over time, and resilience, which ensures that the resource and the users dependent upon it can effectively withstand and adapt to risks, stressors, and unpredictable shocks. And it's important to emphasize that water security is not simply a water sector issue. It's a broader socioeconomic, environmental, and political concern. And it encompasses protections from waterborne diseases and pollution. It relates to proactively planning for water-related disasters in an uncertain future. But it also, and perhaps most importantly, is about sustaining the resource to help safeguard peace and political stability. So we want to talk a bit about limitations with the traditional approach to water management. And this approach has principally been about responding to water risks with engineering infrastructure solutions that often focus on supplying more water and protecting against floods and drought. These solutions, they're typically favored because water managers are often civil engineers who are trained to design and build, but also because political decision makers tend to favor large infrastructure projects for their political benefits. There are a number of shortcomings of this traditional approach, however, as it gives little consideration to the negative externalities to water user groups beyond the intended beneficiary communities. And as a result, it often fails to deliver the long-term social, environmental, economic, and institutional benefits across water users. We often refer to water problems as wicked problems. This means that they're difficult to evaluate because of a number of factors, including incomplete or contradictory information or divergent stakeholder concerns and priorities. And they're also difficult to solve because you can only mitigate impacts but not remove risks entirely. And they require local and specific solutions, as generic and blueprint solutions rarely work. In addition, it's important to note that management solutions and approaches of the past may no longer be appropriate or accurate with future uncertainty. So I want to talk a bit about the differences between water security and integrated water resources management, known as IWRM. So IWRM has been the dominant planning approach in the water sector since the late 90s, and it's recently received critiques, and it's proven challenging to implement in practice due to practical difficulties of implementing it successfully on the ground across a range of different contexts. Water security does have some things in common with IWRM. For example, it focuses on hydrological scales, it promotes integrated multi-sectoral approaches and stakeholder participation. It places an emphasis on ecosystem health and the importance of governance approaches. But it's also quite different in a number of ways. It's fundamentally a risk-based approach, and it places a much stronger emphasis on risk assessment and risk mitigation. And this is due to the growing recognition that water influences and is influenced by other areas of political, social, and economic instability. So water security provides a much more focused lens on achieving tangible outcomes by reducing specific risks and building resilience in defined geographies. So framing water management around water security helps to turn some of these idealized principles of IWRM into much more focused and practical interventions and bottom-up stakeholder-driven solutions. We want to discuss a little bit about the role of water security in the context of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH interventions. And perhaps one of the most important points to get across is that WASH and water security depend on each other, and the success and sustainability of one is not possible without the other. For example, in order to ensure and sustain access to drinking water, the source water that supplies that drinking water must be properly managed and sustained. In addition, providing drinking water is only the first step in human development. We know well that economic growth leads to greater water demands for other uses, such as agriculture, energy, and other productive activities. And the use of water to support these other sectors is critical for economic development, and it also in turn helps contribute to the financial sustainability of WASH interventions. We've seen with the new Sustainable Development Goals that SDG 6 demands much closer coordination between WASH and water resources management. The new SDG targets expand the WASH agenda to consider the whole water cycle with a much greater focus on issues such as ambient water quality, wastewater management, water use efficiency, IWRM, and freshwater ecosystems. So to effectively support water security, WASH interventions must take into account risks, water scarcity, pollution, and climate impacts, among others, as well as the drivers of these risks that we described earlier, along with taking into account the cumulative impacts of multiple water withdrawals and how this impacts water security for upstream or downstream communities, both now and in the future. So now I'll hand it back over to Eric to talk about the water security improvement process.
Hi there, we're getting some very good questions, and I just wanted to remind people that we're going to answer them at the end of the session. Thank you. Eric, you can speak now.
Okay. Thanks, Liz. Sorry, I think I was muted, so that's why I couldn't speak before. So I'm going to walk us through the water security improvement process. It's actually detailed through a series of 6 toolkits that you can find on our website. I would say it's somewhat a traditional process, but it does present some specific features to ensure focus and sustainable results. And that process relies on an inception checkup and 5 key components, as you can see on the slide. And Liz, yes, you'll have to go down with the slides because I don't think I have control. So next slide. I'll start with, so the inception steps, the initial phase, it's basically a checkup phase to ensure that a series of enabling factors are in place to ensure that the process can unfold properly and bring results. So we identified 5 such factors. The first one being, of course, financial support, which can come from government or donors or other sources. That financial support is critical to not only support the process, but most importantly to legitimize it by ensuring that there is funding for implementation and for delivering tangible benefits. As we say in the US, proof is in the pudding. And if there is only funding for studies, you're going to have many disappointed stakeholders. At the end of the day, they want their water issues solved. So that's the first enabling factor. A second one is a confirmation that water security is relevant, that there is a pain, that water security is important to a range of water users and stakeholders. There is willingness to get engaged. There is interest. There is a potential to develop a fruitful water security improvement process. Also critical is governmental endorsement to validate the process and its outcome so that the resulting action plan is binding and implemented. And along those lines, it's also essential to frame the process within the existing legal framework in the country where we operate to ensure its compatibility with relevant national or regional documents such as water strategies, master plans, and some of the IWRM frameworks such as river basin committees and plans or water user association. All these are very useful tools for a successful water security improvement process. Final factor is, of course, the necessity to operate within a safe environment. Unfortunately, insecure areas or places where armed conflict is unfortunately occurring, it often prevents a participatory dialogue around water security issues. So the first step in the process is what we like to call focus. It's basically defining the water security improvement space, and it has 4 dimensions. And it's basically answering the question of who, what, where, and when. Who, it's about which stakeholders to engage in the process. And it's the key challenge here is trying to reach out to representative leaders among those who influence decision-making for water. We are talking about government policymakers and managers, and also from water user groups, both communities and businesses whose health and livelihoods directly rely on water resources and services, and that are affected by water decision-making. And that second group is often difficult to engage, but is essential because water users are those who waste and pollute water resources out of ignorance and self-interest. I mean, just plain survival sometimes. And not involving them, those stakeholders in the solutions, it will basically perpetuate harmful water use practices, wastages, pollutions, and may also impede the implementation due to inertia or even resistance sometimes. And along those lines, special attention is necessary to engage marginalized groups such as women and youths, who often represent a large constituency of water users with often a limited say, even at community level, in water decision making. So next question to be answered is a what. What is it that we are trying to address? Especially if it's the first time that such a process is developed. Not all water risks can be addressed due to limitations in resources, in time and in funding. So when the water security improvement process is being applied for the first time, it's really critical to be focused on some issues, some water risks, and achieve tangible outcomes to legitimize it and to prove that it works. So let's not try to bite too much in the initial steps. The next question to answer is the where. What is the geographic area where that water security improvement process will take place? Here it's a bit of a trade-off between different perspectives. There is the geographic perspective. The optimal geography is often a self-contained river or aquifer basin, because for obvious reasons, it allows a clear definition of what water we are talking about, what are the water resources, what is the water cycle we are looking at. But another perspective that's also sometimes conflicting is the administrative perspective, where to involve regional or provincial authorities in the process. It has to be the area of focus has to match the area of authority. So that's a competing perspective. There's a third perspective that can also be considered. It's the approach of problem shed. It's trying to match the geography with the water risk or water risks that are being addressed. The last question is the when. It's a time horizon. It's important to set a time horizon to guide the evaluation of the current trends of future conditions, the analysis of possible actions and their short, mid, and long-term impacts, and of course the setting of implementation targets. So the time is the last dimension in that space. The next step 2, is basically the start of the look at water risks. It's what we call the assessment. Again, it's a traditional process. And it's about assembling a common baseline and at the same time bringing all stakeholders around the table, educating all of them on what are the main water risks. It's about finding a balance between the water risk as they perceive them and the water risks, some of them unknown to them, such as groundwater, for example, that specialists can bring to their attention. And basically the assessment looks at the current and future status of 3 key dimensions. First one is the physical dimension, water and related resources. The second one is the institutional setup. How is water management operating? What we often call the governance, the water governance framework, which looks at institutions, laws, policies. And the third dimension is risks. We want to operate from a risk perspective, that is the identification of potential hazards, the vulnerable populations, assets or areas, and then the likelihood and severity of the impacts when you cross hazards with vulnerabilities. And as John mentioned before, we are here talking about hazards coming from known and somewhat predictable trends or stressors or drivers, population growth, economic and trade growth, urbanization, etc. And then there are also unpredictable shocks that can be natural, such as natural disasters, floods, droughts, tsunamis, landslides, etc. Or can result also from human activities. You can have economic and political events, conflicts. You can also have harmful algal blooms and other types of pollutions that come from human activities. A specific requirement for the water security assessment is to find an optimal balance between producing a comprehensive study of the water security situation and providing an adequate and timely set of information or baseline to address priority water risks. The danger here is to spend a lot of time and resources to study and to kind of lose stakeholders along the way, because at the end of the day, if you bring local community leaders to the table, they want to show something to their constituents. So there has to be a balance between being thorough in the assessment and achieving concrete, tangible outputs. The next step, once you have that common baseline, the next step is planning and funding. It's basically, it's first about prioritizing water risks, which ones are going to be addressed. Not all can be addressed, as I mentioned before, especially if the process is implemented for the first time. It's then a negotiated process where solutions are identified, they are defined, they are explored, they are analyzed, they are compared, and there is a negotiated process where stakeholder representatives try to select which approaches they feel respond the best to the challenges they are facing. Funding is one reality check. There has to be, those actions have to be realistic. There are too often large action plans that provide a wide array of activities, and there's very little funding to implement anything. So it can create lots of frustrations. And there is the idea also of doing robust decision making in the selection of solutions, in the sense that very often decision makers try to go for optimal solutions. The problem is that there are lots of uncertainties as to what the future will look like. So sometimes it's better not to go for, or often it's better not to go for optimal solutions, but to go for what we call robust solutions. That is, solutions that can perform pretty well across a wide range of possible futures. And that's better than having an optimal solutions that may be completely sabotaged by a future that was not really forecast and taken into account. So the next step in the process, once an action plan has been defined and that action plan has targets, expected benefits, resource and capacity needs, costs, roles, and timelines, the next step is, of course, to implement. And in parallel to implementation, and that will be the following step, but I want to mention it now, it's also monitoring and evaluation and adaptation. So when we talk about implementation, we talk first about having an implementation that is integrated in the sense that it combines hardware and software. There is the usual expression not to put all eggs in the same basket. If most activities are based on infrastructure, well, they may all fail at the same time. And that's why it's important to address the other dimensions of the environment within which we operate. It's important to have what we call software actions, such as watershed management or green infrastructure, behavior change campaigns. Again, it's important to look at how people use water, and policy, institutional or management improvements. Also, we can also call them governance improvements. Having an integrated set of solutions that complement each other is much more effective and much more flexible in the future. During implementation, it's important to have adequate reporting so that sponsors, higher authorities continue to trust and see that the process is unfolding properly, and at the same time inform water users and the public at large to demonstrate the usefulness of the process to show that results are being achieved. So communication is also a very important consideration for implementation. A final point I want to mention here is compliance, where when activities should be implemented, they have to be compliant with existing standards and regulations, such as environmental regulations and social regulations. In parallel to implementation, as I mentioned earlier, we have the next step, which is monitoring and evaluation and adaptation. It's often neglected, but it's important. It's essential to improve over time the definition, the selection, the design, and implementation of water security activities. It also allows implementers to detect early on delays and issues during the implementation. And it supports what we call adaptive management, that is the capacity to make adjustment when necessary, to reallocate resources or equipment or staff when an activity seems to not be developing properly and other activities are more promising. Basically, this is what is often called monitoring and evaluation, M&E. It's often described as learning from experience, including from mistakes. And it's also about accountability. It's about recognizing successes and failures and building the capacity of implementers, of stakeholders to collaborate among government officials, local leaders, business managers, and collectively address those water security risks and learn not only about solutions, but learn to work together during the process. So this is a process we have. The next slide summarizes that process. A final point I want to make is that, especially if the process is being done for the first time, well, there has to be the idea that the process is only a beginning, that process will be repeated on a regular or ad hoc basis. There can be also dissemination and scale up. If the process works well in one watershed, it can be extended to neighboring watershed or be scaled up to a larger watershed. So that's really the sustainability aspect of the water security improvement process, and it has to be understood from the very onset of the process. My final slide is about 8 key practices that we've identified and that should support the process. I will go pretty quickly over them because we've already mentioned several of them. The first one is about focus. We've talked about that, so I won't go back to that. Second one is about water user participation. Again, we talked about that. So water users are the actors that affect water resources. They have to be involved in the decision making, involved in the solutions. The third practice is what we call the system thinking approach. And the objective here is really to focus on causes and drivers and not symptoms. There is sometimes a mistake that looks at the symptoms and not really at what's causing that. And that's where the focus should be. It's also the idea of having a bit of a holistic approach and see how related issues can impact water resources. I can mention, for example, land tenure or energy subsidies. They often have an impact on water use practices. The fourth practice, it's about uncertainties. We have to be humble and recognize that there are lots of things we don't know, especially regarding the future and what's going to happen in terms of climate variability and change, for example, but also in terms of human behavior, in terms of technological changes, socioeconomic and political conditions. And again, here, that's what leads to the idea of coming up with robust and not optimal solutions. So next, guiding practice, I think I mentioned that it's the idea of negotiation. Water users, stakeholders have to be part of the discussions, and implementation is much better when there is a broad consensus on the selection of the activities that are implemented. And also the idea of integrated actions, looking at the 4 types of activities we mentioned before. 3 more practices, the idea to use information science and fact-based solutions. That's also very important, acknowledging that sometimes we don't have enough information, but we still have to try to find solutions and then learn as we go. Adaptive management is something I've mentioned. It's something that's also builds over time. And the final practice I want to mention is, of course, to ensure sustainability, the usual goals of economic efficiency, environmental soundness, and social equity have to be kept in mind as solutions are defined, assessed, compared, and eventually selected and implemented. So I'll stop there in my presentation, and I think, Liz, we will field some questions.
Yes. We got a bunch of good questions from everyone. The first one that I wanted to address was, are these slides going to be available? And yes, we will make them available at the end of the presentation. We can send those out, and they will also, this recording will also be available in a day or 2, and we will send out a link for that as well. And
okay,
here's some more questions. How do you concretely apply this process in the Mara in Cambodia where you are currently working?
That's, that's what we've started doing for a few months now. I will have John maybe first give a quick overview of what we are looking at in the Mara River Basin, and then I'll talk about Cambodia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. So I'll just start by quickly saying that, as we've discussed a bit in this presentation, each basin and geography is, in a very different situation, and as a result is at a different starting point, potentially along the process that we've laid out. And, I'd say that that's definitely the case for the Mara and Cambodia. With the Mara, there's been a lot of work supporting the Mara over the years, and much of that has been funded by USAID. So, we're really focused on building on those successes, and that's why defining that water security improvement space is really important to determine what to focus on. So what we're focusing on in the Mara, so our sort of space for engagement is to build on a recently signed MOU between the governments of Kenya and Tanzania for joint water resources management and the Transboundary Basin. So one of our partners for this activity, IHE Delft, has been working over the last few years on providing technical support to develop a water allocation plan for the Kenyan portion of the basin. So we're going to be helping to extend this plan to the Tanzanian portion of the basin, harmonizing it with the Kenyan plan to create a basin-wide water allocation plan that will in turn help the two governments and stakeholders understand and agree upon decisions for how water is allocated across different sectors and between the two countries. We'll also be using the process that we've laid out, supporting stakeholders in two subcatchments, one on the Tanzanian side, one on the Kenyan side, to analyze and select strategic water security measures for implementation that address specific risks facing those two subcatchments. And then finally, we're going to be supporting the institutional framework that was sort of defined and laid out by the MOU by helping to clarify roles and responsibilities across different institutions at the transboundary, national, and subcatchment levels. We're going to be working very closely with the Lake Victoria Basin Commission as our main institutional partner in this activity, but also working hand in hand with institutions at the national and subcatchment level in both Kenya and Tanzania. So Eric, I'll let you talk about Cambodia.
Sure, thanks, John. So in Cambodia, we are focusing on one river basin called the Stangshinit. It's one of the tributaries of Tonle Sap Lake. And here we are working with the Tonle Sap Authority and with provincial authorities at the level of the Kampong Tom province. We chose that river basin because it's a river basin that has seen significant infrastructure investment in recent years, especially on irrigation. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the hardware is there, but the software did not follow. And there are some issues regarding watershed management. The north or upstream part of that river basin is in the Prelong area, which is a protected area and suffers from deforestation and other activities. There is definitely an issue around behaviors, water use practices. There are growing concerns around pollution due to overuse of pesticides and fertilizers. And in terms of institutional improvements, there is definitely a good framework in Cambodia in terms of forming a farmer water user association, forming a river basin committee. But even if the framework is there, the practice is not there yet. So that's something that we really want to do is build those entities that are essential for involving stakeholders and building a sustainable dialogue between provincial authorities and local leaders, again, from civil society and business interests. So that's what we want to unfold in the Stangshinit River Basin. Yeah, Liz, if we can field another question. I don't know how many questions we can field. We don't want to make this session too long.
We are getting a lot of questions, though.
Okay.
There have been a couple questions about what tools can support the WSI process. Can one of you speak to that?
You want me to start, Eric? Or?
Sure. Yeah, why don't we give us a quick overview?
Okay. So, we view tools as sort of not the ultimate solution, but something that helps to facilitate the process. And so, part of that means that we first, try to understand what tools are already in place, and then build upon those and determine if there are gaps and the need for other tools that may not be present. And our SWP consortium, we within our partners have a number of different tools that can be applied to different steps along this process. For example, Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, has a tool called the Water Evaluation and Planning Tool. And this is a systems-based hydrological modeling software that helps to guide stakeholders through a decision support process, which helps to determine potential impacts from changes in water supply and demand across different development scenarios. And the outcome of that is working with stakeholders to identify, Eric was talking about this term, robust decisions, but to identify, what decisions and actions can be implemented that really work well across a range of different scenarios. Winrock, moving to Cambodia, Winrock's developed a tool in Cambodia known as the Watershed Ecosystem Services Tool, the WEST tool, and that allows stakeholders to explore how ecosystem services, land use, socioeconomic factors, and other factors impact watersheds. World Resources Institute, WRI, one of our other consortium partners, has a tool called Aqueduct, and this is a water risk mapping tool, which can help raise awareness and identify at a more macro scale where water risks are most significant. And then one of our other partners, MWater, has a data portal which helps stakeholders to manage water data collected through mobile apps. And so there are a number of different tools and methods that can be used depending on different situations. But as I mentioned at the outset, we're really focused on selecting those that are most relevant and building upon what already exists.
Thanks, John. So one point I just want to add is that at the end of the day, these are tools, so they support a process, but we have to be careful that we keep the human beings at the center of the process, and the tools only support the process. Most of those tools that are computer-based, and if the data you enter and if the processes that you've modeled in the tools are not appropriate, then you're going to get very inadequate solutions, and it would be a bit short-sighted to just conclude that those results are valid and useful. So that's something to keep in mind. I'd like Liz to, I think we shouldn't take too much time, and if there are other questions, we'll find a way to answer them, and hopefully we will have other webinars in the near future. And also we will on our website develop what we call a community of practice, that is a capacity for people to send questions, also contribute their own experiences, their own lessons learned. I'd like just to address a couple of questions around water user participation, because I believe that's something that's not only essential, but also a challenge in many places where there is not necessarily a culture of dialogue. And there were a couple of questions about, involving water users and how to do that. I think it's a question of involving on one and educating on both sides of the equation. On the government side, it's about helping government officials take better decisions, helping understand that they should share the burden of decision making, the accountability of decision making. And by involving local leaders, again, from business interests and communities, they can make better decisions, they can have better information, and they can also have a better communication to the public at large in terms of how the decisions were made and what they're based on. And again, they share the burden with local leaders, so the decisions are better grounded and usually have better results and are more easily accepted. On the other side, as you bring local leaders to the table, it's important that those understand that even if they have limited capacities, they are still to be part of the solution. And they shouldn't just come to the table with a long list of issues and requests. They should also come with their own solutions. They should also understand that they are part of a team that's going to mobilize resources, and even poor communities have resources. They have labor as a resource. And this is something that they have to keep in mind. They are part of the team. They are not just there as requesters. They have to be actors and not just beneficiaries. So I think finding those win-win aspects on both sides is what brings the two sides of the equation together. And at the end of the day, it's how it's been done in many countries. It takes a long time. It's behavior change. It's one of those aspects of behavior change. Planning together, assessing together, planning together, implementing together, reassessing again. But that's really one of the fundamental elements of the water security improvement process. Liz, I don't know if we have more questions, but it's been about 45 minutes. I don't want this recording to be too long. So except if there is a very critical question, I would probably stop there so that we can have other webinars in the future.
All right, we can follow up with the other questions that were sent to us.
Yeah, we will definitely do that, and we'll have to find a technical way to do that, but we'll do that. But we'd like to thank all of you for joining us. And Liz, you wanted to add a few more directions?
Oh, of course. I just wanted to say that if you enjoyed this webinar, you should check out our website. And especially if you like the content of the webinar, you should download our PDF version of Toolkit number 1. And Toolkit number 2 and 3 are currently available. So check those out as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and take care, and hope to talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.